Commander Kael'veth stood at the observation deck of his warship and stared at the dead world below, a planet that had once held 3 billion lives, but now held nothing but ash and silence. And he felt the cold hand of fear grip his ancient heart for the first time in 200 years. The Void Harvesters had returned. He had read about them in the historical archives, those terrible records from an age when even the Ascended Ones walked among mortals and wielded powers that could reshape stars. And yet even those godlike beings had failed to destroy the Harvesters completely, had only managed to drive them into the dark spaces between galaxies, where they had slept and waited and grown hungry once more. Now they were awake, and they were feeding. The communication panel behind him chimed with an incoming transmission from Fleet Admiral Torvon, the supreme commander of the Silithran Empire's military forces, and Kael'veth turned to receive his orders with the poised confidence of an experienced commander. Dignity expected of an officer who had served for 3 centuries. "Commander," the Admiral's holographic image spoke with a voice heavy with exhaustion, "the Galactic Council has assembled a coalition fleet to face this threat, and your battalion has been assigned to the forward assault group." Kael'veth nodded, for this was an honor befitting his record and his experience. But then the Admiral continued speaking, and the words that followed made his blood turn to ice. "You will be integrated with human forces for this campaign." "Humans?" Kael'veth could not keep the disgust from his voice. "Admiral, surely there has been some mistake, for the humans are barely 3 centuries into spaceflight. They are children playing at war while real soldiers prepare to face extinction." The Admiral's expression remained unchanged, though something flickered in his ancient eyes that Kael'veth could not quite read. "The Council has made its decision, Commander, and you will follow your orders." The transmission ended, and Kael'veth stood alone with his fury and his disbelief. He knew of humans, of course, for every species in the galaxy knew of the strange soft creatures from the small blue world called Earth, those bizarre beings who lived barely a century and spent most of that time fighting amongst themselves over patches of dirt and abstract concepts they called ideals. The Silithrons had watched humanity crawl into space with a mixture of amusement and concern, for these creatures bred like insects and spread like disease, and seemed utterly incapable of the patience and wisdom that defined the elder races. They were loud and emotional and reckless. They made decisions based on feelings rather than logic, and they threw themselves into conflicts with an enthusiasm that bordered on madness. And now Kael'veth was expected to fight alongside them against an enemy that had made the gods themselves tremble. Days later, he stood in the docking bay as the human vessel arrived, a ship called the ISS Defiance that was ugly and blocky and covered in what appeared to be battle scars from a dozen different engagements. The airlock opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Kael'veth prepared himself to meet whatever barbaric war chief the humans had sent to command their forces. Instead, a woman walked through the door. She was small, standing barely to the height of his chest, with dark hair cut short and practical, and skin marked by scars that told stories of violence survived. And her eyes were the most unsettling thing about her, calm and steady and ancient in a way that made no sense for a creature so young. "Commander Kael'veth," she said, and her voice carried an accent he did not recognize. "I am Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Unified Fleet, and my people are honored to fight beside the Silithran Empire." He looked down at her and made no effort to hide his contempt, for she was small and fragile, and would probably be dead within a decade from simple old age, even if the Harvesters did not kill her first. "Captain," he said the word like it tasted bitter, "I hope your people understand that this is not a training exercise, that the enemy we face has destroyed civilizations older than your entire species." She smiled at him then, and there was something in that smile that he did not understand. something that looked almost like pity. "We understand, Commander, and we will try not to disappoint you." Behind her, more humans filed through the airlock, soldiers in mismatched armor, carrying weapons that looked crude compared to Silithran technology, and among them walked others who made Kael'Veth stop and stare in confusion. There were children. There were elderly humans with white hair and bent backs. There were humans who were clearly not soldiers at all, carrying personal belongings and holding hands, with the warriors as if they were family members saying temporary farewells. Except they were not saying farewell. They were coming aboard. They were staying. "Captain Vasquez," Kael'Veth heard his own voice sharp with disbelief. "Why have you brought civilians onto a warship that will see combat within the week?" She looked back at the stream of humans still entering his vessel, and then returned her gaze to him with those impossibly calm eyes. "They are our families, Commander. Your families have no place in a war zone. With respect, Commander, we do not ask our families to wait at home and wonder if we will return, because we learned long ago that the waiting is its own kind of battle, and we do not ask anyone to fight alone, not even the ones who stay behind." He wanted to argue, wanted to demand that she remove these helpless creatures from his ship before they became casualties, but something in her voice stopped him, something that spoke of depths he could not fathom. That night, Kael'Veth walked through the human section of the ship and watched them preparing for war in ways that made no sense to him. He saw soldiers cleaning weapons while children sat nearby doing what humans called homework. He saw an old woman teaching a young Marine how to cook something that smelled strange, but made the humans smile with memories of home. He saw lovers embracing without shame, holding each other as if each moment might be their last, and perhaps it would be. And he saw Captain Vasquez sitting alone in a small chapel the humans had constructed, a room filled with symbols from dozens of different belief systems, her head bowed and her lips moving in what might have been prayer. She sensed his presence without turning around. "Do you believe in gods, Commander?" "The Ascended Ones are real," he answered. "Their existence is documented fact." "That is not what I asked," she said softly. "Asked if you believe in them, if you trust them to save you when the darkness comes." He had no answer for that. She stood and walked past him toward the door, pausing only to say one final thing. "My great-grandmother survived a battle called Stalingrad, Commander. A fight where humans killed each other by the millions over a single city. And she taught my grandmother something important. Something that is passed down through my family for generations." "What did she teach her?" Captain Vasquez looked at him with those ancient eyes in her young face. "That the gods help those who refuse to stop fighting. And when the gods are not enough, humans help themselves." She walked away into the corridor, leaving Kael'Veth alone with the sudden uncomfortable feeling that he had badly underestimated these strange soft creatures from Earth. The Shroud Nebula burned with the light of dying ships as Kael'Veth gripped the arms of his command chair and watched the battle unfold on screens that showed nothing but horror and death. The Void Harvesters had come in numbers that defied all intelligence reports, a swarm of black vessels that moved like living things and fired weapons that passed through shields as if they did not exist. And everywhere Kael'Veth looked, he saw coalition ships breaking apart and crews dying in the cold silence of space. "Forward batteries are offline," his tactical officer reported, voice trembling with barely controlled fear. "We have lost contact with the 3rd and 4th strike groups. Casualties are approaching the withdrawal threshold." Kael'Veth nodded grimly, for this was the Silithran way of war, a doctrine refined over millennia that prioritized survival and strategic retreat over pointless sacrifice, and the mathematics were simple and clear. 12%. You pulled back and regrouped. When losses exceeded 20%, you retreated entirely and lived to fight another day. The coalition fleet had already lost 18% of its strength, and the battle had barely begun. "Signal the fleet," Kael'Veth ordered, feeling the weight of defeat settling onto his shoulders. "Begin organized withdrawal to Rally Point 7. All ships are to maintain formation and cover each other during retreat." "Commander," his communications officer said with confusion in her voice, "the human vessels are not responding to the withdrawal order." Kael'Veth turned to stare at her, certain he had misheard. "What?" "The ISS Defiance and her escort group are accelerating toward the enemy flagship. They are not retreating. They are attacking." He pulled up the tactical display with hands that had suddenly gone cold, and watched in disbelief as the crude human warships charged directly into the heart of the Harvester formation. Their engines burning at maximum power, their weapons firing in continuous streams that seemed almost desperate. "Open a channel to Captain Vasquez immediately." Her face appeared on his screen, calm as always, despite the chaos visible behind her. Alarms blaring and crew members rushing to their stations, and she smiled at him with that strange smile he still did not understand. "Commander Kael'Veth, I assume you are calling to ask why we are not running away." "Captain, you must withdraw. Your ships cannot survive a direct assault against those numbers. You are throwing away your lives for nothing." "With respect, Commander, we are not throwing away anything. We are buying time." "Buying time for what?" "For you to escape," she said simply. "For the colony ships behind the fleet to reach safe distance. For the children in my lower decks to have a few more hours of life before the darkness finds them." Scream at her that this was madness, that no tactical doctrine in the galaxy supported suicide charges against superior forces, that she was condemning her people to death for the sake of beings who would not even remember their sacrifice. But the words died in his throat as he watched what happened next. The ISS Defiance had lost its engines, torn apart by harvester weapons that left the ship drifting and burning. And yet the vessel did not stop fighting, its remaining guns still firing even as its hull began to break apart. And then the airlocks opened. Kael'Veth watched in stunned silence as human figures poured out into the vacuum of space. Tiny shapes in armored suits that should have provided no protection against the cold and the radiation and the enemy fire all around them. They were not fleeing. They were attacking. The humans flew through space on personal thrusters, carrying weapons and explosives, and they aimed themselves directly at the HC. Nearest harvester vessel, like living missiles, like warriors from some primitive age when battles were fought with swords and bare hands. "They are boarding," Kael'Veth whispered, unable to believe what he was seeing. "They are actually boarding a void harvester ship." No species had ever attempted such a thing, for the harvesters were not truly ships at all, but living organisms wrapped in metal shells, creatures that existed partly in normal space and partly in dimensions that drove other beings insane. And yet the humans went anyway. The battle inside the harvester vessel was invisible to external sensors, but Kael'Veth could imagine it. Close-quarters combat in corridors that twisted and changed, fighting against an enemy that could strike from angles that should not exist, dying by the dozens with every step forward. 40 minutes later, the Harvester command ship exploded from within. The remaining Harvester vessels faltered, their coordination non-existent, disrupted by the loss of their command node. And in that moment of confusion, the Coalition fleet escaped, jumping to safety with thousands of lives saved by the sacrifice of creatures who should not have been capable of such things. Kael'Veth found Captain Vasquez in the medical bay of a rescue ship 3 hours later, her arm in a regeneration cast and burns covering half her face. And around her sat the survivors of her crew, fewer than 200 from an original complement of over 500. He expected to find them broken, traumatized, reduced to silence by the horror they had experienced. Instead, he found them singing. The song was in a language he did not know, something old and sad and beautiful, and the humans sang it together, with tears on their faces and their arms around each other. mourning their dead in a way that seemed to celebrate them at the same time. When the song ended, someone brought out bottles of liquid and small glasses, and the humans began to drink and to talk and to laugh at memories of fallen friends. A young Marine, with fresh burns across his neck, noticed Kael'veth standing in the doorway, and waved him over with a smile that should not have been possible, given what he had just survived. "Commander, come, sit with us, have a drink for the dead." Kael'veth found himself accepting the glass without conscious decision, the liquid inside burning his throat in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. And he sat among the humans as they shared stories of those who had not returned. He watched Captain Vasquez listen to a young woman describe how her husband had died holding a corridor so that others could escape. And he saw tears fall from those ancient eyes, but he also saw her smile at the memory of his bravery. "Captain," he said quietly when there was a pause in the stories, "how do you do this? How do you keep fighting after losing so many? How do you not despair?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she lifted her glass toward the stars visible through the medical bay window. "Because they are watching, Commander. All of our dead, every human who has ever fallen in battle going back to the first war we ever fought. They are watching to see if we are worthy of their sacrifice." She drank, and the other humans drank with her. "My great-grandmother used to say that humans are not brave because we do not feel fear. We are brave because we feel fear and fight anyway, because we know that death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person." "What is worse than death?" Captain Vasquez smiled that strange smile again. "Living with the knowledge that you could have done more, that you could have saved someone but chose yourself instead, that you let the darkness win because fighting was too hard." She put her hand on his arm, and the gesture was warm despite her. "Injuries. Commander, we lost 400 people today, and tomorrow I will order more of my people into battle, and some of them will die too. And this will continue until the war is won or we are all dead. Does that not terrify you?" "Every moment of every day," she said, and there was no shame in the admission. "But being terrified does not give us permission to stop. It never has, it never will." Kael'veth stayed with the humans until the singing resumed, and when he finally returned to his own ship, he carried with him the beginning of an understanding he could not yet put into words. These strange, soft creatures were not mad, he realized. They were something far more dangerous than that. The War Council chamber aboard the Coalition flagship was the largest room Kael'veth had ever seen, a vast circular space designed to hold representatives from every species in the Galactic Council. And today, every seat was filled with beings who had come to decide the fate of 12 worlds and 2 billion lives. The Helix cluster stood directly in the path of the Void Harvester advance, a collection of inhabited planets that had been home to countless generations of settlers from dozens of species, and the question before the Council was simple in its cruelty. Could they be saved, or must they be abandoned? Admiral Torvand stood at the central podium, his holographic displays showing the tactical situation in stark detail, the red markers of Harvester vessels outnumbering the blue markers of Coalition forces by nearly 10 to 1. "The mathematics are clear," Torvand said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to recommend. "The Helix cluster cannot be held, and any attempt to defend it will result in the destruction of our remaining fleet without meaningfully slowing the enemy advance." Murmurs of agreement ripped through the assembled admirals and generals, beings who had lived for centuries and understood that sometimes survival required sacrifice, that you could not save everyone, and trying to do so would only ensure that no one survived. "Our recommendation is strategic withdrawal," Torvand continued. "We will evacuate essential personnel and military assets. We will preserve our forces for future engagements at more defensible positions. We will accept this loss in order to prevent greater losses." It was the logical choice, the wise choice, the choice that any reasonable being would make when faced with impossible odds. And then Admiral Chen Wei of the Terran Unified Fleet stood up and asked permission to speak. Kael'Veth had heard of Chen Wei, a human who had spent 60 of his 80 years in military service, a man who had fought in 3 interstellar wars before this one, and won them all, through methods that other species found disturbing. And now he stood before the council with a calm expression that matched Captain Vasquez's perfectly. The Terran Unified Fleet respectfully declines the order to withdraw. Silence fell over the chamber like a physical weight. Admiral Chen, Torvald said slowly, "This is not a suggestion. This is a strategic directive from the Coalition Command." "I understand," Chen Wei replied, "and I repeat that we declined, because we do not abandon civilians to die when there is still a chance to fight for them, no matter how small that chance might be." "There is no chance," a Krell delegate called out, his massive insectoid form clicking with agitation. "The tactical projections are absolute. You cannot win this battle." "Then we will lose it," Chen Wei said simply. "We will lose it fighting, and we will take as many of those monsters with us as we can. And when the last human ship burns, we will climb out of the wreckage and keep fighting with our bare hands if we have to." He activated his own holographic display, and the image that appeared made several delegates gasp in shock. It was a battle plan, but not like any battle plan Kael'Veth had ever seen. The humans called it Total War Doctrine, and it showed a vision of combat that belonged in nightmares rather than strategy meetings. "We will arm every civilian capable of holding a weapon," Chen Wei explained, his voice calm, as if he were discussing supply logistics. "We will teach them to fight, to hide, to ambush, to make the enemy pay for every street and every building and every room." The display showed cities rigged with explosives, agricultural fields poisoned to deny resources to the enemy, orbital platforms converted into kinetic bombardment weapons aimed at the ground below. "We will make the harvesters bleed for every inch of ground they take, and when they finally overwhelm us, we will trigger devices that will turn our own worlds into tombs that nothing can survive." "You would destroy your own planets?" a Silithran delegate asked, horror evident in his voice. "We would burn the galaxy itself if it meant our children have a chance to survive," Chen Wei answered, and there was no madness in his eyes, only absolute conviction. The chamber erupted into chaos, delegates shouting over each other, some demanding that the humans be restrained before their insanity infected the entire coalition, others simply sitting in stunned silence at what they had just heard. And then the light changed. Every being in the chamber fell silent as a presence manifested at the center of the room, a figure made of pure luminescence that hurt to look at directly. A shape that was humanoid but clearly not human, radiating power that made Kael'Veth's scales itch with ancestral terror. An Ascended One had appeared. The last time one of these godlike beings had shown themselves to mortal creatures was over 10,000 years ago, at the end of the First Harvester War, and their presence here could only mean that something fundamental had shifted in the nature of reality. "You would burn your own worlds," the Ascended One said, and its voice was like thunder and whispers at the same time, filling every corner of the chamber without seeming to have a source. Admiral Chen Wei turned to face the divine being without flinching, his expression unchanged, his posture that of a soldier addressing a superior officer, rather than a mortal confronting a god. "Yes, you would poison your own lands, destroy your own cities, sacrifice your own people, all for the mere possibility of survival?" "Yes." The Ascended One was silent for a moment that stretched into eternity, its luminous form flickering with patterns that might have been thoughts or emotions, or something beyond mortal understanding. "The architects created your species," it said finally. "We seeded your world with the building blocks of life, as we did countless others. We watched you grow and evolve and stumble into the stars, and in all that time, we never understood you." It moved closer to Chen Wei, and the human did not step back. "We fought the Void Harvesters in the age before memory. We drove them back at terrible cost, and we believed that we had earned peace through our sacrifice, that the universe owed us safety because we had paid in blood." The Ascended One's light grew brighter. "But you do not think like this, do you? You do not expect the universe to reward your suffering. You do not believe that sacrifice earns you anything, except the right to sacrifice again." "No," Chen Wei agreed, "we do not." "This is why the architects fear your kind," the Ascended One said, and the admission sent shockwaves through the chamber. "We look at you, and we see creatures who should not exist, beings who face oblivion and feel anger instead of acceptance, who look at impossible odds and see only a challenge to be overcome." It turned to address the entire council, its voice ringing with something that might have been admiration or terror or both. "The harvesters feed on despair, on the knowledge that resistance is futile, on the surrender that comes when beings accept their own destruction. But when they encounter humans, they find no despair to feed on. Only defiance. Only an absolute refusal to accept that death is the end. And this makes humanity more dangerous than any weapon ever created." Its final words echoed through the chamber long after its light had vanished. "Fight your war, little humans. Fight it with fire and blood and all the fury your short lives can contain. And perhaps, you will teach us old ones something we had forgotten." The chamber remained silent for a long time after the god disappeared. Then Admiral Chen Wei turned back to the podium and spoke 3 words that changed the course of the war. "We fight here." One by one, the other delegates began to stand, Silithrons and Krell and a dozen other species rising to their feet, not because they believed victory was possible, but because they had just witnessed something they had never expected to see. They had seen a god admit fear, and the object of that fear was standing before them with calm eyes and an absolute refusal to surrender. Kael'Veth stood with the others, and for the first time in his long life, he felt something like hope. The sky above Helix Prime burned with falling ships, as Kael'Veth pulled himself from the wreckage of his escape pod and looked upon a world that had become a vision of hell. The Coalition fleet had lasted less than 6 hours against the Harvester Armada, and now the enemy descended upon the planet like a plague of locusts, their landing craft touching down in fields and cities and forests, disgorging creatures that moved wrong and killed everything they touched. Kael'Veth had 12 survivors from his command staff, soldiers trained in space combat who had never expected to fight on solid ground, and they huddled in the crater left by their crash landing and waited for death to find them. Instead, salvation came in the form of a human child. She could not have been more than 12 years old, a small girl with dark hair and dirt on her face, and she appeared at the edge of the crater like a ghost and beckoned to them with urgent gestures. "Come with me if you want to live," she said, and her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible for someone so young. "The tunnels are this way. Quick, quick, before the crawlers find your heat signatures." Kael'Veth wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand how a child had survived when his warship had not. But the sounds of harvester movement in the distance convinced him that questions could wait. They followed the girl through a hidden entrance into a network of tunnels that seemed to stretch beneath the entire city. Passageways carved from stone and reinforced with metal, lit by dim emergency lights and filled with the sound of distant activity. "How long have these tunnels existed?" Kael'Veth asked as they walked. "We started digging them the day the first reports came in," the girl answered. "My grandmother says humans have been digging tunnels to hide from enemies since before we had metal tools. It is what we do when the surface becomes too dangerous." Led them to an underground chamber that took Kael'Veth's breath away. Hundreds of humans filled the space, civilians and soldiers working side by side, manufacturing weapons at improvised workstations, treating wounded fighters in medical bays carved from storage rooms, training children barely older than their guide to assemble explosives and clean rifles. An old woman with white hair and steady hands looked up from the device she was building and smiled at the Silithran commander. "Welcome to the Resistance," she said. "I am Maria Chen, and I used to be a chemistry teacher before the war. Now I make bombs. Funny how life changes." "You are building explosives?" Kael'Veth asked, staring at the complex device taking shape under her wrinkled fingers. "Someone has to," Maria replied with a shrug. "My grandson is out there fighting right now, and he needs weapons that can hurt those monsters, so I learned how to make them. We all learned how to do things we never expected." Over the following weeks, Kael'Veth learned what human resistance truly meant. He watched teenage runners dash through harvester-controlled streets, carrying ammunition and medical supplies, moving too fast and too unpredictably for the enemy to track, knowing that capture meant death, but running anyway because their friends needed what they carried. He saw a human father strap explosives to his chest and walk into a harvester command post because his daughter was trapped in a building behind enemy lines, and he needed to create a distraction. And his last words over the radio were that he loved her, and to make his sacrifice count. He witnessed a group of human elders refuse evacuation to a safer bunker, because the journey would slow down the fighters, and they spent their final hours cooking meals for the soldiers and singing songs from their childhood to give the young ones courage. And through it all, he fought beside Captain Vasquez, somehow survived the destruction of her ship, and made her way to the surface to continue the war. They were pinned down in a collapsed building when Kael'Veth finally asked the question that had haunted him since the day they met. "Why do your people fight like this? You have no natural weapons, no armor, no venom. You live barely a century, and yet you throw yourselves into battle as if death means nothing to you." Vasquez was reloading her weapon, her movements practiced and efficient, and she did not look up as she answered. "Death means everything to us, Commander. That is precisely why we fight so hard against it." "I do not understand." She finished reloading and finally met his eyes, and in that moment he saw the weight of every loss she had suffered, every friend she had buried, every nightmare that waited for her when she closed her eyes. "We are afraid, Commander, every single one of us, every moment of every day. We are terrified of dying, of losing the people we love, of watching everything we built turn to ash." "Then why do you not surrender? Why do you not accept the inevitable and preserve what lives you can?" Vasquez said, and there was fire in her voice now. "Being afraid does not give us permission to stop fighting. It never has. It never will." She leaned closer to him, and her words carried the weight of generations. "My ancestors survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. They survived because they refused to accept that death was the end, because they kept fighting and breeding and building, even when everything seemed hopeless. And you believe you can survive this?" "I believe that giving up guarantees we will not survive," she answered. "I believe that fighting gives us a chance, even if that chance is small. And I believe that our children deserve to see us try, rather than watch us surrender." The harvesters breached their position an hour later, and Kael'Veth fought beside humans who screamed defiance at creatures from the beyond. Nightmare, who used their broken weapons as clubs when the ammunition ran out, who threw themselves at enemies twice their size to buy their comrades seconds of survival. He saw a human medic drag his wounded body through 3 blocks of enemy territory, and when he asked her why she had risked her life for an alien she barely knew, she looked at him with confusion and said simply, "You were hurt? You needed help." He understood then, truly understood, what made humans so terrifying to the gods. It was not their strength, or their weapons, or their technology. It was their absolute refusal to accept the limitations that other species considered natural. They did not calculate odds and accept defeat when the numbers turned against them. They did not preserve themselves at the cost of others when sacrifice could make a difference. They simply kept fighting, kept struggling, kept reaching for survival, with bloody hands and broken bodies. Deep in their genetic memory, they carried the knowledge that their ancestors had faced extinction before and won. And that made them dangerous beyond measure. As night fell over the burning city, Kael'Veth helped the humans fortify a new position, and when Captain Vasquez asked if he wanted to try to escape to friendly territory, he surprised himself with his answer. "No," he said, "I will stay, I will fight, I will learn." She smiled at him, that strange smile he finally understood. "Welcome to humanity, Commander." The plan was madness. Kael'Veth knew this with absolute certainty, and yet he also knew that madness was simply another word for human thinking. Terran scientists have discovered that the Void Harvesters were not independent creatures, but extensions of a single massive consciousness, a hive mind that coordinated their movements and strategies from a structure deep in the void between stars, a living moon of neural tissue and metal armor that pulsed with the thoughts of a billion connected minds. Destroy the hive mind, and the entire harvester swarm would fall silent. The problem was reaching it. The hive mind had been constructed at the center of a harvester fleet so vast that it blocked out the stars, protected by layers of defenses that no weapon in the Coalition arsenal could penetrate, accessible only through tunnels that twisted through dimensions that drove sensors mad and pilots insane. The human plan was to capture a harvester vessel, ride it directly into the hive mind's core like a virus entering a body, and detonate an experimental weapon that would sever the neural connections holding the swarm together. It was a one-way mission. Everyone understood this. The volunteers would not be coming home. Over 10,000 humans volunteered within the first hour. They had to turn people away. Kael'Veth stood in the briefing room as Captain Vasquez explained the mission parameters to the selected strike team. 300 humans, chosen for their skills and their willingness to die, and when she asked for any final questions, he raised his hand. "I wish to volunteer for the assault team." The room fell silent, human faces turning to look at the Silithran commander, who had fought beside them for months, who had bled with them and mourned with them and learned to sing their songs of defiance. "Commander," Vasquez said carefully, "this is a human mission. You do not have to do this." Kael'Veth replied, "But I have spent 300 years living by the doctrine of my people, calculating acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals and the mathematics of survival, and I have learned something from your species that I cannot unlearn." He stood straighter, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. "I have learned that some things are worth dying for, that the measure of a life is not its length, but its meaning, that the greatest victory is not surviving, but ensuring that others survive." He looked at Vasquez with eyes that held no fear. "I am not human, but I would be honored to die as one." She smiled at him, that strange, beautiful smile, and nodded her acceptance. The assault began 3 days later. The captured harvester vessel screamed through dimensions that had no names, its human passengers fighting off the madness that pressed against their minds through sheer force of will, holding each other and singing, refusing to let the darkness take them. When they breached the hive mind's outer defenses, the fighting began in earnest. Kael'Veth had experienced combat before, centuries of it, but nothing had prepared him for the hell inside the living moon. The corridors pulsed like veins, the walls shifted and changed with every step, and the harvesters came at them from angles that should not have existed. Creatures of nightmare, defending their central consciousness with fury that bordered on desperation. The humans died by the dozens, but they did not stop. He watched a young soldier throw himself onto a harvester to save his squadmates, his body torn apart in seconds, but his sacrifice buying enough time for the others to reach the next checkpoint. He saw an old sergeant with wounds that should have killed her an hour ago continue fighting from her knees because she refused to die until her ammunition was gone. And when it was gone, she used her rifle as a club, until she finally fell. He witnessed humans drag their broken bodies forward through corridors slick with blood, refusing to stop, refusing to die, refusing to accept that the mission could fail, because failure was simply not acceptable. By the time they reached the central chamber, only 7 remained. Kael'veth, his scales cracked and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Captain Vasquez, her left arm hanging useless at her side, and her face pale from blood loss. 5 human soldiers who had been strangers before this mission, and were now brothers and sisters in the only way that mattered. The hive mind's core pulsed before them, a mass of neural tissue the size of a building, and they could feel its attention focusing on them, like the weight of a mountain pressing down on their minds. "Get the device in position," Vasquez ordered, her voice steady despite everything. "I will hold them off." "Captain, you cannot." She raised her weapon and walked toward the swarm of harvesters converging on their position, firing with her one good arm, and the 5 soldiers rushed forward to plant the experimental device, while Kael'veth stood frozen between duty and something he had never felt before. He made his choice. He charged forward to fight beside her, and together they held the line, 2 broken warriors against an endless tide, buying seconds with blood and bullets and sheer stubborn refusal to fall. When his weapon ran empty, he used his claws. When his claws broke, he used his teeth. And when he finally collapsed, his body simply unable to continue, he looked up to see Vasquez standing over him, her weapon empty, her body failing, but her eyes still burning with that impossible human fire. "The device is armed," one of the soldiers called out. "Everyone fall back to minimum safe distance." There was no minimum safe distance. They all knew this. Device would destroy everything within 100 kilometers, and they were at the center of it. Vasquez looked down at Kael'veth and smiled. "Tell them," she whispered, blood on her lips. "Tell them we were here. Tell them we did not go quietly." She pressed the detonation trigger. The last thing Kael'veth saw was light, pure and absolute, and then darkness, and then impossibly, he opened his eyes to find himself floating in the wreckage of what had been a moon. They found him 3 weeks later, the only survivor, protected by a pocket of debris that had shielded him from the worst of the blast, through some miracle of physics or fate. The harvesters were silent across the entire galaxy. Without their hive mind, they had become nothing but empty shells drifting through space, a threat that had terrified gods, reduced to harmless debris by the sacrifice of 300 humans who had refused to accept defeat. Kael'veth stood before the Galactic Council 1 month later, his body still healing, his mind still processing everything he had witnessed, and he delivered his report to an audience that included the Ascended Ones themselves, luminous figures who had manifested to hear his words. "You asked me to assess humanity as a military asset," he said, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "I cannot do this, because they are not an asset, they are not a weapon, they are something far more dangerous." He paused, remembering Vasquez's smile, the songs in the tunnels, the child who had led him to safety, the grandmother who made bombs to protect her grandson. "They are a promise," he continued, "a promise that no matter how dark the night, no matter how great the enemy, no matter how certain the defeat, someone somewhere will stand up and fight, not because they will win, but because surrender is simply not in their nature." The Ascended Ones were silent, their luminous forms flickering with patterns he could not read. "The gods are right to fear them," Kael'veth said, "because humans do not believe in inevitable endings. They do not accept that some battles cannot be won. They look at impossible odds and see only a challenge that demands their very best." He raised his head and spoke his final words with absolute conviction. and that makes them the most terrifying force in the universe. The Ascended Ones bowed their heads, a gesture of respect they had never shown to any mortal species in recorded history. In orbit above Earth, humanity was already building a new fleet, for they had learned that the Void Harvesters were only the vanguard, that something larger was coming, something that had sent the Harvesters as a test. They were not afraid. They were preparing. And somewhere in the great archives of the Silithran Empire, Kael'Veth added a new entry to the records of the war. A simple statement that future generations would read and remember. "They taught us how to fight," he wrote, "not for survival, but for meaning, and that made all the difference. The humans had won, and the galaxy would never be the same."